Welcome to our third class on the book of Daniel. My name is John Galloway, and this lesson was presented on Thursday evening, 21st January 2021, in a Zoom class for the British Bible School, as the United Kingdom is in lockdown. This is the outline that we're using for this particular study. It's a 12-week study, so it divides up very nicely between the 12 chapters. This week, of course, we're in the third week, so we'll be looking at the golden image and the fiery furnace. John Lennox wrote about this particular chapter in his commentary. He said, the account of Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their ordeal in Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace is justifiably one of the most famous stories in biblical, perhaps in all literature. A story much loved by the children who are still fortunate enough to be taught it. And maybe that's a good indication for us that we do need to be looking at teaching our children about the Bible. We get a possible date for this chapter from the introduction to the Septuagint. The Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures. Net Bible Study Notes had this to say: the Septuagint introduces this chapter with the following chronological note. In the 18th year of. Such a date would place these events at about the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. However, there seems to be no real basis for associating the events of Daniel 3 with this date. And from my study, this is the only date I could find for the chapter. It is very much an undated chapter. If this is even halfway correct, then our timeline here, we've done chapter 1, which is in 605, chapter 2, approximately 603. If the Septuagint is right, then chapter 3 would fall in just about 586 or so BC. With whatever the date is, it's going to be within the range between 605 and 585. The text opens up in chapter 3 and tells us that Nebuchadnezzar made a statue of gold. Now, probably it was not solid gold, but most likely overlaid with gold. There are many items that have been done like that over the years. Warren Wiersbe in his commentary said, when Daniel explained the meaning of the success of metals in the massive images back in chapter 2, he identified Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold. And perhaps this is what helped motivate the king to make an image of gold. Not content to be merely a head of gold, he and his kingdom would be symbolized by an entire image of gold. There is definitely an element of pride in this whole enterprise. And I think he's got some right ideas in what he suggests there. This image that he built, the statue, was 60 cubits tall, the text tells us. Now, if you're like me, I don't think in terms of cubits. That would be about 90 feet tall. Not quite 30 meters if you think in terms of meters. About the size of a 10-floor building. Now, I was trying to figure out, all right, what do I know of that's about that height? Lived in Glasgow for many years. I'm just south of Glasgow just now. If you go into George Square in Glasgow, you will see that there is a pillar, a column. And on the top is Sir Walter Scott. And that is 80 foot tall. So if you add another 10 feet to that, that's the size of this image. If you've been to the Lake District and you've been to Ulverston, just outside of Ulverston, in fact, you can see it as you approach Ulverston, is this monument here to Sir John Barrow. It stands on Hoad Hill. This monument is 100 feet tall. So the one that Nebuchadnezzar made was about 10 feet shorter than that. Now you may think, that's awfully tall for that era. But there are other statues of the ancient world that are known to be around this height. In fact, the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, dates from about the 200s BC, was said to be 70 cubits tall. That's about 105 feet tall, 32 meters tall. This image that Nebuchadnezzar made had a 6-cubit breadth. In other words, it was 9 feet wide. Now that could have been a reference to the base of it. We're not told what this statue was. Possibly it was of Nebuchadnezzar himself, or maybe even a representation of what he dreamed of in chapter 2. We just don't know. The Net Bible Study Notes noted this, that according to a number of patristic authors, the image represented a deification of Nebuchadnezzar himself. This is not clear from the biblical text, however, and it's really not clear. They're absolutely correct there. But a number have thought that he was deifying himself, possibly something like that. Some suggest it was just some sort of a false deity, such as Bel, that's spelled B-E-L. Notice that in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar refers to it as my God or my gods. This image that he made was set up on the plains of Dura. Now, we believe the plains of Dura was just outside the city of Babylon, but we can't pinpoint precisely where this is because there are many sites with this name in ancient Babylon. All who were involved in his government in various positions were to come for the dedication of this image. And as you look through the names of the various positions in his government, some of those are not familiar to us because they're mainly transliterated names. For instance, you'll see possibly satrap there. It's not one that we use today. It literally means protector, and it's thought to be probably the governor of a province. Homer Haley commented that 7 specific offices were named, plus all the rulers of the provinces were at the gathering. The precise official position of the 7 named is so uncertain that any attempt to relate them to our national rulers is omitted. Daniel's naming them indicated his thorough acquaintance with the organization of Nebuchadnezzar's empire and its provinces. The large number and presence may shed light on the period of his reign, indicating the height of his world conquest. So, we don't know who they are precisely, but they are the rulers of the nation. All the officials of the kingdom, undoubtedly representing all the people, were to publicly worship this image. This was not a private worship for just the initiated. This is public worship. Outwardly, everyone had to conform to this worship. The king really couldn't issue an order for people to change their hearts. He could order them to bow down to his image. Since all people from all over the empire were to worship this new god, it would appear that Nebuchadnezzar intended to unite his kingdom under one religion, worshiping this one god. A fanfare of music would be heard, and everyone was to bow before the image. Now, the types of instruments that are listed depend on the translation of the scriptures that you're using. We don't know what many of these instruments were. We can make some speculations, though. It mentions there, this is the Net Bible, a horn. Most likely that would be a ram's horn or some other animal's horn that would be blown. The Israelites used one frequently called a shofar, a ram's horn. There was mentioned a flute, or it could be in your translation a pipe. The idea seems to be this was some type of a whistle. You may have seen these in some of the statues from the Grecian period. There was a zither, or a lyre, or a cithara. Zither. A zither is an instrument, a stringed instrument that would be held on your knees and strummed. And it seems to be that type of instrument that's being referred to here. There is a trigon. Now, the name itself should tell us something about it. Tri, 3, it's a 3-sided harp having 4 strings. And also mentioned is a harp. Your translation may have psaltery, which I understand was another triangular oriental stringed instrument, which had a sounding board. Then there's the word pipes. Now, your translation might have bagpipes, although doubtful to be as we know it in Scotland today. Could be translated ensemble, even drum. Most of the scholars tell us that the Aramaic word for pipes, either means everybody playing together, or is a reference to an instrument like the double flutes or the drums, or you sort of get the impression we don't know what it is. Then finally, it just says all kinds of music. It takes care of everything, doesn't it? Homer Haley comments that, like the officials named in verses 2 and 3, the 6 kinds of musical instruments named would be so different from ours that any attempt to identify them would be of little value. And I think that's the problem, isn't it? The words used for these musical instruments at one time was one of the reasons many scholars said that this had to be a 2nd century BC composition. We've now found that these words fit very well into the 6th century BC. With more, because what we've done is we found more lists of items from that time period that have been found and translated and published. So this actually fits very well into a 6th century BC time frame. If people refused to bow down to this image, they would be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Nebuchadnezzar seems to be trying to unify his kingdom in one religion and also using fear, is he not? This blazing fire, this furnace, most likely it was a charcoal-fueled kiln. These were common in this area for making bricks or smelting ore. We've excavated several, archaeologists have excavated quite a few of these in the area. Usually we know that these had an opening in the top for placing the fuel and the ore or the bricks into the furnace. There would be a door at the bottom where they could remove what they had in there, the metal or whatever it was. And there were also openings in the wall to allow the workers to keep an eye on the progress of the process. There were also holes in the wall where bellows could be used to make the fire hotter. These furnaces were usually large enough for several people to be inside and able to move around. Not that that was the purpose, because it wasn't, but that was sort of the size we're looking at. So when the music sounded, there was an immediate reaction. Everyone bowed down. They didn't want to be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Homer Haley points out in his commentary that to the pagans, this would be without conscientious objection, for it would be only another god added to those which they already worshipped. But it would be a different matter with the Jews. And that leads to the problem, does it not? Verse 8, we discover, as always, there were enemies of God's people. Some Chaldeans came forward to let Nebuchadnezzar know that 3 of his subjects had refused to comply with his order. That they're referred to as Chaldeans would tend to indicate that these were the wise men that we've met in chapters 1 and chapter 2. Why did they turn in their fellow wise men? There's speculations as to why. 2 best ones I saw was possibly they were jealous of the quick promotions of these foreigners. Maybe they wanted to get rid of them. And then again, maybe they wanted to win favor for themselves with the king. So they bring malicious accusations against the Jews. The Aramaic there literally is they ate the pieces of the Jews. Now, we wouldn't use that sort of phraseology for this, but the Net Bible Study Notes comments that this is a rather vivid idiom for slander. As they're talking to the king, they first emphasized that he had issued a command. They reminded him of the penalty. It seems like they're trying to make sure that he's not going to try to get out of it. And then they informed him that 3 Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they used their Babylonian names, they had refused to obey the king and worship his god, an image. Again, Homer Haley comments that their charge against the 3 Jews leaves the appearance that they were using a religious charge to accomplish a political end. The whole accusation smacks of envy and jealousy on the part of the accusers. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. Somebody had defied his order. So he commanded the 3 to be brought before him. John Lennox, in his commentary, wrote this: "The gloves were off. In his intemperate rage, the emperor let slip what really lay behind the whole ceremony. He did not say, 'Who is the God who will deliver you out of the hands of my God?' He said, 'Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?' The golden image was but a representation of Nebuchadnezzar himself. After all, as the text repeatedly points out, Nebuchadnezzar had himself set it up. It was Nebuchadnezzar's power that the 3 men had challenged, and he was giving them another chance to acknowledge that his power had no limit." The king's anger may have been greater because he was the one who had promoted these 3. Now we well may ask, what about Daniel? Why was he not amongst these 3? There's several speculations as to why. Maybe he wasn't there. Maybe he was out of town on the king's business. Maybe his category of ruler wasn't in the ones that were mentioned there at the beginning of the chapter. Maybe he was, but he wasn't with that group. And he didn't bow down, but nobody turned him in. We don't know. But he's not listed. He does record the incident, but he's not listed. But he's never mentioned with any of those titles there, so that may be partially the answer. The king questioned the 3 men as to whether the report that he had heard was true. Had they intentionally defied him? Had they intentionally disobeyed him? Notice that he does not condemn them on hearsay alone. He wanted them to confirm the truth of the report that he had heard. And he was willing to give them a second chance. Perhaps he was thinking that they hadn't understood the instructions. So he gives them in detail to them once again. When they heard the music, they needed to fall down and worship his image. If they didn't, they would be thrown into the furnace. He adds here, what God, literally the Aramaic there says what hand, could then deliver them from Nebuchadnezzar's hand. He was trying to frighten them into submission. The 3 men replied basically, there is no need for a second chance. They would not bow down. David Reckton wrote in the Truth for Today commentary, these individuals had determined not to be defiled by the king's food. That was back in chapter 1, they were equally determined not to be defiled by the king's religion. See, they served a God who they knew could rescue them from the furnace, but even if he didn't, they would not bow down. Farrer talks a bit about this phrase, if our God be able. He wrote that by the phrase, if our God be able, no doubt as to God's power is expressed. The word able merely means able in accordance with his own plans. The 3 children knew well that God can deliver and that he has repeatedly delivered his saints. But the willing martyrs were also well aware that in many cases it has not been God's purpose to deliver his saints out of the peril of death, and that it has been far better for them that they should be carried heavenwards on the fiery chariot of martyrdom. They were therefore perfectly prepared to find that it was the will of God that they too should perish, as thousands of God's faithful ones had perished before them from the tyrannous and cruel hands of men. And they were cheerfully willing to confront that awful extremity. You see, that they are willing to lay down their lives in defiance of Nebuchadnezzar's order to worship an image. Homer Haley commented that a stronger declaration of faith in Jehovah cannot be found anywhere than that expressed by these three men. Their response should not be interpreted as one of insolence or disrespect for the king, but of determination based on a firm belief of their faith. They were putting their total trust in God. A second chance wasn't necessary because they weren't going to comply with the instructions and fall down to worship the image. Warren Wiersbe wrote, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were men of faith, but not men of presumption. Had they affirmed that God would deliver them, that would have been presumption because they didn't know what God had willed for their situation. Instead, they stated that their God was able to deliver them. But even if he didn't, they still wouldn't fall down before the king's golden image. They weren't serving God for his protection. They were serving God because they knew of something far better that was coming. They were not going to break God's commands. Nebuchadnezzar, once again, filled with rage, angry at this challenge to his authority. The text tells us that his disposition changed. Literally, it would be translated, the appearance of his face was altered, and some of the translations emphasize that the rage could be seen on his face. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than it normally was. We mentioned that these furnaces have places you can put a bellows in, and bellows would heat up hotter. By the way, that phrase 7 times hotter, that may just be a phrase that means the maximum possible, 7 being the number of completeness. So that may be what's referred to there. Wiersbe had an interesting idea about this, though. He said the king's anger must have affected his mind, for the best way to punish the men wasn't to increase the temperature, but to decrease it. A hotter fire would kill them instantly and then burn them up, but a lower temperature would cause them to suffer intense pain before they died. So if he's tried to increase their discomfort, he's not really succeeding there. The king had some of his strong soldiers, his mighty men, the strongest of them, to bind the 3 friends in their clothing. And we don't know what precisely some of those Aramaic words mean for the articles of clothing, whether they're bound by parts of their clothing or they're bound while wearing their clothing. Ferrer, in his commentary from 1895, said something to the effect that they were bound in their hosiery, which I thought was an interesting way of expressing it, but definitely putting a medieval slant on the incidents here, whereas this goes back a lot further than that. But the idea here seems to be that they're bound up, they're tied up. Nebuchadnezzar is making sure that there was no resistance, no further defiance by these 3. Because the furnace was so hot, and because of the haste to get them thrown in, the men who threw in these 3 Jews were killed by the flames. It would seem that they got too close. Possibly it was so hot that their clothing burst into flames, and they died. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. It is here that if we were in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, we would find the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the 3, which is contained in the Apocrypha. If you have a Bible that has the Apocrypha, have a read, because it's an interesting read there. There are 3 apocryphal sections that are added to Daniel that the Septuagint contains, in mainly the Roman Catholic Bibles, but some of the other Bibles as well. have the Apocrypha in it. This is probably the best of the three that have to do with Daniel. The Net Bible Study Notes points out that the Deuterocanonical writings, known as the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three, present at this point a confession and petition for God's forgiveness and a celebration of God's grace for the three Jewish youths in the fiery furnace. Though not found in the Hebrew Aramaic text of Daniel, these compositions do appear in the ancient Greek versions. So they stem from the Septuagint, which is several hundred years after the Hebrew Aramaic. We don't have any of the Jewish scriptures that contain these additions that we call the Apocrypha. Nebuchadnezzar could see into the furnace, possibly through an opening at the base where the air would flow in, or through the opening where they could keep an eye on what's going on. What he saw frightened him. He asked his counselors, had they not thrown three bound men into the furnace? Yet looking in, he saw four, and these four were untied and walking around. And the fourth was like a god. In other words, the fire seems to have burned off the bindings and hadn't hurt them. Now, just how Nebuchadnezzar would recognize the appearance of a son of the gods, we know not, Homer Haley writes. But there was something so striking about him that it brought forth the exclamation, a son of deity, as Young, in his literal translation, puts it. He spoke from the viewpoint of a pagan and pagan deities. Now, we're not told who this fourth one was that's in there. Some think that this was Jesus, primarily because of the King James Version, which translates this, the Son of God. And it very well could have been what we refer to as a theophany, that is, Jesus in his pre-human form. Homer Haley in his commentary takes his view. Most suggest that it was most likely an angel, a messenger sent by God. The Net Bible Study Notes says this: the phrase like that of a god is in Aramaic, literally like that of a son of the gods. Many patristic writers understood this phrase in a Christological sense, i.e. the Son of God. But it should be remembered that these are words spoken by a pagan who is seeking to explain things from his own polytheistic frame of reference. For him, the phrase like a son of the gods is equivalent to like a divine being. Despite the king's description, though, the fourth person probably was an angel who had come to deliver the three men, or was a theophany. So, whichever, what we see is God or his messenger entering the fire to neutralize the capacity for it to harm God's people. In other words, God was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, and he did choose to deliver them. John Lennox wrote, the whole experience was utterly unnerving, particularly the presence of the mysterious fourth figure that had been seen in the fire, a figure that seemed to Nebuchadnezzar to resemble a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar had issued what he thought was a rhetorical challenge to the heavens. What god shall deliver you out of my hands? To his utter horror, he discovered there was a God in the heavens who could do precisely that. A God to whom Nebuchadnezzar's threats meant nothing. That God had identified himself with the men in the fire, loosed them, and delivered them. Once again, God had invaded Nebuchadnezzar's world, and he was demanding the emperor's attention. Nebuchadnezzar went to the door of the furnace and called for the servants of the Most High God to come out. And when they came out, it was observed that the fire had not bothered them. Their hair wasn't singed. If you've been very close to a flame, you know you very quickly, your hair gets singed on your arms or your fingers. Their clothing wasn't harmed at all. In fact, they didn't even smell like smoke. Literally, the Aramaic there is the fire did not have power. You know what it's like when you are around something that's burning and it produces smoke. We end up smelling of smoke, don't we? But there's no smell of having been around fire on them. John Goldinghay writes, the three had not been delivered from the fire, but they are delivered in the fire. And I think that's a good statement to make. He quotes somebody who said that. He didn't keep them from the fire. They had to go through the fire, but he did deliver them in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar then praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had sent his angel to deliver these men who had trusted in God rather than obeying the king, and they had refused to worship any other god. Notice that Nebuchadnezzar here equates the son of the gods, as he had referred to him earlier, with an angel. So very well could be an angel that we have here. Homer Haley says, Nebuchadnezzar was greatly impressed and deeply moved by the wonderful miracle he beheld, but it failed to do for him what it should have done. To him, God was still the tribal deity of the three men. The king praised their faith in him and their refusal to worship any other god than their own. Also, he praised them for their willingness and readiness to offer their bodies to the flame in demonstration of their faith. He then made a decree. Anyone who spoke against their God would be torn limb from limb, and their houses would be laid in ruins. Why? Because there was no God who could rescue like theirs. And this, by the way, in essence, legalized the Jewish religion in Babylon. He also, once again, promoted the three men in the province of Babylon. Now you can just imagine how angry those who had brought the king's attention to what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had done. You can just imagine how angry they were, because they were hoping, I think, to get rid of them or to promote themselves. But instead, it's in their minds, their enemies who are promoted. This, by the way, is our last glimpse of these three Jews. The rest of the book centers on Daniel. This incident would seem to be alluded to in that great chapter of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, where the writer said, what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel the prophets. Through faith they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire. That one there, quenched raging fire, would seem to be a reference to this incident here. Of course, shut the mouths of lions, we're just about to get to that in a few more weeks, aren't we? When we get to chapter 6. But to complete the quote there, they escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength in weakness, became mighty in battle, put foreign armies to flight, and women received back their dead raised to life. So it seems like the Hebrew writer cites this incident here in Daniel chapter 3. Wiersbe asks the question, why did the Lord include this story in the Old Testament scriptures? Then he answers it. For the same reason he included stories about the faith experiences of Abraham, Moses, Joshua, David, and the prophets, to encourage God's people in their battle against the world, against the flesh, and against the devil. For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. This is included to give even those of us today encouragement in the battles that we face. So, what are the lessons that we can learn from Daniel 3? Suggested that the theme of the book is God is in control, God is sovereign. We see that here in this chapter as well. He is the one who's in control, and it's not Nebuchadnezzar who sentenced three men to die in a blazing fire. God rescued his people from that tyrannical king. God is in control. Second lesson I think we can see, this is tying it in with chapter 1, is that if we don't give in on the small things, that's a reference back to chapter 1, where they didn't give in on the change of diet, don't give in on small things, then we have the strength to not give in on the big things. Warren Wiersbe commented that the three men could have compromised with the king and defended their disobedience by arguing, everybody else is doing it, or our office demands that we obey, or we'll bow our knees, but we won't bow our hearts. They might have said, we could do our people more good by being officers in the king's service than by being ashes in the king's furnace. But true faith doesn't look for loopholes. It simply obeys God and knows that he will do what is best. Faith rests on commands and promises, not on arguments and explanations. Yeah, they didn't offer an excuse, didn't try to compromise. Instead, they weren't going to give in. A third lesson I think we can see is that we need to have a genuine faith and conviction of what we believe so that we will remain faithful in difficult times. We have trials, we have opposition that we go through. We need to remain faithful. Faith, Wiersbe writes, means obeying God regardless of the feelings within us, the circumstances around us, or the consequences before us. It's our faith that we hang on to no matter what. A fourth lesson I think we can see here is going through trials should serve to increase our faith and trust in God, as it did for them. Maybe we should ask ourselves the question, do we have the kind of faith that can be tested and bring glory to God? Or is our faith the kind that when tested crumbles? Again, Warren Wiersbe commented, the devil tempts us to destroy our faith, but God tests us to develop our faith. Because a faith that can be tested can't be trusted. Faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. False faith withers in times of trial, but true faith takes deeper root, grows, and brings glory to God. One thing we see in this chapter is that God may choose to deliver us. God is able to deliver us. But that doesn't mean that we have nothing to do. John Lennox elaborated on this. He said, there is an important matter of principle here. God is a great deliverer, but he will not deliver us from having to make our own decisions. This is not because he is impotent, but because he wants us to be strong. The development of our character depends crucially on the fact that we make responsible decisions before God for ourselves. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to make up their own minds as to whether they were going to put God first. That does not mean they had no guidance. Their guidance was all the accumulated experience of God's trustworthiness up to that fateful moment. Now, we have decisions to make, and God wants us to make decisions. I've seen more and more people in the age in which we live who want somebody else to make their decisions for them. They just want to be told what to do and they'll do it. I've had Christians tell me that. But you see, God's not what God wants from us. God wants us to learn to make our own decisions. One thing we can see in this chapter is, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're going to go through trials. Some of them might even be considered fiery. How are we going to face them? We can either give in or we can forsake our faith. Give in and forsake our faith, or we can allow that trial to refine us, to make us stronger. We often sing a hymn which goes like this: how firm a foundation, you saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he has said? To you who for Jesus to refuge have fled. Fear not, I am with you. Oh, be not dismayed, for I am your God and will still give you aid. I'll strengthen you, help you, and cause you to stand, upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand. When through fiery trials your pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be your supply. The flames shall not hurt you. I only design your dross to consume and your gold to refine. The soul that on Jesus still leans for repose, I will not desert to its foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never, no never forsake. We see verse 3 there. It would seem that the author was reflecting on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By the way, we don't know who precisely wrote this hymn. It's a famous hymn. It was simply signed K with a dash. There's some supposition as to who this person might be, but we don't know for sure. And the last thing I think to think about is, how do we react if it's our lives that are at risk for being a Christian? See, we need to remember that there's more to life than the here and now. We are living for the eternity that will never end. As Christians often say, the best is yet to come. Homer Haley summarizes by saying, this is certainly a source of encouragement to saints in any period of judgment or persecution. God fulfilled the promise to the Jews by a divine messenger in the furnace with the three of his faithful servants. As the saints of the New Testament faced the fiery trials of life as Christians, he was with them, so also he will be with us. But this assurance is only for those who face these judgments with the degree of faith and conviction possessed and demonstrated by the three of the captivity. John Lennox concludes for us by saying, Daniel records an extreme situation. Even though many of us may never have to face the ultimate penalty for public witness to our faith, although the likelihood of having to do so is increasing, the principles involved in the stand made by Daniel's three friends apply to all of us at different levels. By studying the ultimate case, we can learn much that will be of relevance to our everyday witness. It is this that makes the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego relevant in every age. After all, the confession that lies at the heart of the Christian faith is Jesus Christ is Lord. This section of Daniel asks us how seriously we take it. His three friends did not shrink from presenting their bodies as a living sacrifice. Would I? And I'll leave you to ponder that particular question. Thank you for taking time to watch this study. I hope you can join us for our next study, as we will then be looking through Daniel chapter 4.